In this video, we're going to explore blocks, scope, and variables. A lot of times I'll say make it an attribute, make it a local variable, make it a parameter variable, and the response that I get back is, well, what's the difference? So in this video, we're going to look at what these different variable types are, as well as what a block is, what a scope is, and essentially where we can declare variables. So first of all, a block. A block is a boundary of code starting with an open curly and ending with a closed curly. You'll see this several times when we're programming. You'll see it to begin and end a class. You'll also see it to begin and end a method, and a method has to be inside of a class. You'll also see it beginning and ending blocks of if tests and for loops, which have to be inside of methods. So you see, we can actually nest quite a bit. We could have an if test inside of a for loop, and that for loop's inside of a method, and that method is inside of a class. Each of these have boundaries of open and closed curlies, so we have to be very careful with this. As a matter of fact, if we're not careful, if we remove a curly, run back over to an example here. This is an example from a previous class, but if I go to driver, you see we can have three closed curlies that are all in a row here. That's fairly common. One maybe belongs to a method, another to a loop, another to an if test. And if we're not careful, if we delete one, it can cause real trouble in our program because our program doesn't compile because there are more open curlies than there are closed curlies. An analogy I often use to describe the curly is it kind of looks like a toothbrush. And I was brushing my teeth and I realized that's how I start and end every day. I wake up and one of the first things I do is brush my teeth. I go to bed and one of the last things I do before going to bed is brush my teeth. So essentially, that's the block that surrounds my day. Everything I do that day, go to work, record videos, everything I do that day is bound by me waking up and brushing my teeth and me going to bed and brushing my teeth. So think of those as toothbrushes. Now, the reason why that's important is we have to think about scope. Variables that are declared within a set of these toothbrushes are only alive from the point where they are declared until that closed curly of the block where it's declared. And I know that sounds a little bit funny, but I have some screen captures and examples in this video where we'll get to look at these in more detail. So, scope also determines the category or the classification of a variable. There are essentially three different categories of variables we're going to have. I'm not talking about variable type, I'm talking about a category. So those three are local, parameter, and attribute. We'll take a look at examples of each of those in just a moment. So, variables that are declared within a block are considered in scope in that block. They're considered out of scope outside of that block, and they cannot be accessed outside of that block. So, let's consider what a block and what a scope is by looking at a simple Java program. And once again, this is one that I pulled from a previous semester of teaching this class, so these are examples we'll eventually work up to this semester. First of all, what is a class? Pay special attention here to the light blue shading, which hopefully comes across okay in the video. So a class starts with this line, public class, and here you have neon extends vehicle. If you don't know what extends vehicle means, don't worry about it. Just know that the line that starts with public, and then class, and then some name is essentially the start of a class. We have an open curly here, and then we have a closed curly towards the bottom. So that defines the boundary or the scope of the class. That's where we're going to do all of our work. Now be careful, because if I reverse that, take a look at these two slides and you'll see that one is essentially the obverse of the other, or the inverse of the other. If I reverse that, I'm showing you some area in blue now. Let's call this no man's land. That's outside of the class. That's where we will declare the package that we're in, which is essentially like a subdirectory or a folder, and anything else we need to import. If that doesn't make sense, don't worry. Just know that the blue area I've shown here, you cannot define a variable in that area. It's simply outside of the class. Okay, now there's a special name for variables that are defined inside of the class, but not inside of another method. That's the blue area that I've shaded here. So you see we are within the open and closed curly of the class, but we are not within the open and closed curly of a method. Variables declared here are called attributes. A few years ago we called them fields. We also called them member variables. Any of those words are interchangeable. If I say attribute and you say field, we're both talking about the same thing. An attribute typically describes a class, and also it is available inside of all of the methods within a class. So if you need one method to have a variable it shares with another method, consider making it an attribute. The only rule for an attribute is where it is declared. Now you see, I've highlighted two different blue areas here. In practice, we tend to only define attributes at the very top of a class. It's rare to put them at the bottom. You will occasionally see that for a user interface screen. Sometimes they'll declare all the widgets towards the bottom. Personal preference based on that, but nonetheless, you tend to find them up at the top. You could theoretically see them between methods, between the end of one method and the beginning of another, but that would be considered sloppy. So for good practice, let's keep them up here towards the top. Okay. Here's an example where I've declared some variable in a class called Prius. Notice I have battery level, miles per milliamp hour, recharge factor, and battery threshold. You see, these are all right after the class declaration line, but they're not within a method itself, so these would be called fields, attributes, or member variables, depending upon your perspective. Now, a parameter variable is a special kind of variable because it's declared in a method signature. Now, what's a method signature? Let's go back a little bit. Do you see this line, public string, toString, and then open curly? The public string and toString is considered a method signature. In other words, it's the way we know a method is unique. Now, you see here we have an open and closed parenthesis and nothing inside of it. But if I forward down to our other slide, you'll see we're declaring a variable. Here, this is a different method, public void go, and you see we're declaring a variable within this open and closed parenthesis. Now, methods are like phones. They can be called. If I want to call you and see if we're meeting up for lunch, I will dial your number, it will call your phone. When we're calling a method, we have an option or an opportunity to pass data to that method. If we're passing data to that method, it's going to be via one of these, a parameter variable. In this case, I've declared one called distance of type int. And you see, and again, I wouldn't expect you to know what everything's going on here in this method because this is from a previous semester, and we haven't gotten there yet this semester, but you can see the word distance is used several places inside of this method. No problem. It's declared here. It's only visible within this method. Local variable is not a parameter variable, and it's not an attribute or a field, but it's a variable that's declared within a method, and it only has scope inside of that method. More specifically, it only has scope from the point it was declared until the closed curly of the block where it was declared. So you see string state equals super.toString. This variable is declared and initialized here, and it can only be accessed from the point at which it was initialized until this closed curly of this method. It cannot be accessed from another method in the same class or another method in a different class. It cannot be accessed before it was declared, so it cannot be accessed up on this line that says foo. So a few considerations. What happens when you try to access a variable out of scope? Your program will not compile. It will throw a red line and it will say cannot find symbol. Cannot find symbol is a tricky one because there are several things that will lead you to cannot find symbol. So if you get that error and you search for it on your favorite search engine, you might find a bunch of solutions that don't work because several things will give you that cannot find symbol. Misspelling, miscapitalization, declared out of scope. These things will all give you cannot find symbol. Now, if we know an attribute has visibility within an entire class and within all of the methods of that class, why not just make everything an attribute? Why do we have parameter and local variables? Well, we want to think of memory management. If we just need to store something temporarily, then a local variable is fine. Like if we're doing a long equation and we want to kind of hold a subtotal just for a few moments so we can use it in another equation, a local variable is good for that. Similarly, we don't want to have too much overhead. We don't want to make things too confusing. Where variables are declared tends to be a bit of inherent documentation. If a variable is an attribute, it typically means it's describing that class. If a variable is local, it means it's only temporary. And if a variable is a parameter, it means it's something we're expecting to get passed in to us. So where a variable is declared, kind of is self-documenting. Okay, so what's wrong here? Here's an example. Take a look at this method. I have string foobar equals foo plus state. Under that, I have string foo equals bar, and string state equals super.toString. The problem here is I'm trying to reference a variable called foo before it's declared, and I'm trying to reference a variable called state before it's declared as well. So this is giving me a red line, which means a compiler error. If I take this foobar, and if I move it down below this declaration of state and foo, everything will be fine. I simply can't have it when it's out of scope. So that'll wrap up this presentation on scopes and blocks and variables. I hope this has been helpful. If so, let me know what you think, or let me know what situations you've run into by leaving a comment down below. Thank you.